Thank you, everyone, and welcome back. This next session, we will hear from policymakers and from Stuart Charity from the Australian Automobile Aftermarket Association about policy developments that have been happening here in Australia. First, Stuart was unable to join us today, so we'll be giving an online presentation to us. So Stuart Charity is the CEO of the Australian Automobile Aftermarket Association, and that represents nearly 300 members and the broader $14 billion Australian automobile aftermarket industry. Stuart and the AAA has led the fight to tackle the aftermarket industry's largest issue, which was mandatory data sharing, with a huge milestone being reached just last month with mandatory data sharing legislation being introduced here in Australia, which is our first right to repair legislation here in Australia. So I would like to invite Stuart to present to you his industry's journey on the right to repair. Thank you, Stuart.
Well, good morning, everyone. Just before I start, I'd like to congratulate the committee of the Right to Repair Summit on this terrific initiative. I only wish that I could have been in Canberra with you all today. Unfortunately, as it has many times over the last 14 months, COVID's got in the way and we were unable to travel up to Canberra. But I look forward to catching up with you all shortly live on the Q&A once the presentations are done. Today, my presentation will be on the mandatory data sharing law that has now been introduced and passed through the Australian Parliament. In fact, it passed the Australian Parliament just a few weeks ago on the 17th of June and went through the House of Representatives 8 weeks before that during March. I'll talk a little bit about the operation of the law in a tick, but essentially, it's being enforced by the ACCC, and in fact, there was a budget allocation this year for nearly $10 million over 5 years, and there are significant penalties for breach of the law. In fact, it's up to $10 million per company per breach. So the law has a lot of teeth, which is fantastic. Now, I know, as I say, I won't go into a huge amount of detail on the law today, but happy to take questions on it or send you follow-up information and so on. Instead, I'll focus the majority of my presentation on our journey because this was a significant achievement. It's the first right to repair law in Australia, and it was a 10-year journey. So it took us a decade to become an overnight success, and there was a lot of hard work and a lot of learnings along the way, and I want to share some of those with you today because I think even though we'll talk about automotive repair and service specifically, I think there are a lot of learnings in other sectors, and one of the important things about this forum, I believe, is having other industry sectors being able to leverage and share experiences. But before I do that, I just wanted to set the scene on why I believe automotive repair and service was first cab off the rank with right to repair legislation in Australia. And I fundamentally believe it's because of a number of reasons. One is that the car is a unique consumer product. There's nothing like it in any other sector. And it's because its attributes. It's you know, when you're buying a car, they're very expensive. In fact, they're often the second largest purchase a family will make outside of their family home. So quite a big capital investment. They're very technologically advanced, and I'll talk about that in a tick. But they're also, they have some unique obligations as well. As you all know, when you buy a brand new car, if you do not follow the manufacturer's specifications and service schedule, then you essentially forfeit your consumer rights over that product. So, and with most cars, there is a requirement to service that vehicle twice a year to maintain your warranty on that vehicle and your consumer rights. The other area is that, and this is a safety-related area for the safety of you and your occupants, but also other road users, there's a legal obligation to keep your car roadworthy, and again, requirements to make sure that bald tyres are replaced, that headlights are fixed, and so on. So that all feeds into what is a very, very large market. That we've got 18 million registered passenger vehicles on Australian roads. Times that by a couple of services a year and repairs and so on, and it's a significant amount spent per household on car repair and maintenance, and the entire industry itself is a $22 billion industry. So significant industry. In fact, we believe, and we're pretty confident, that the automotive repair and service industry would be the biggest repair industry in Australia by far. So that's certainly one factor why we're here today with an industry specific set of competition laws. The other one, as I said at the outset, is around technology on vehicles. This slide is a few years old now. It's 10 years old, and anything to do with technology, it's 10 years is like an eternity. But even back 10 years ago, or 11 years ago in 2010, the average passenger vehicle at that time had more lines of code on it than a 787 Dreamliner and a F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. So these are sophisticated pieces of machinery, and they're becoming increasingly computerised. In fact, from about 2010 onwards, and certainly model year 2012 onwards, the uptake of technology on vehicles has just been exponential. And whilst that technology has created a lot of benefits, cars are a lot safer, they're a lot more economical, and so on, and they have a lot more features on them now. But what that's done by embedding all of that technology into the vehicle, it's given the car manufacturers a very, very powerful mechanism to be able to manipulate the market. And being large multinational companies that are trying to make as much profit as they can, they've certainly taken advantage of that. So what are the barriers to repair in the car industry? Well, they're numerous, and the car companies are very, because as I said, they're controlling that technology, and they've got access to a huge market, so they're highly motivated to try and work every way they can to manipulate the market and to maximise their profits. One of the things that I'll harp on in terms of the learnings, we've done a lot of research and surveys and other information that we've been able to present to government and the regulators to substantiate our position over the years. But one pretty significant one was a survey that we did in 2016. It was at the time when the ACCC were conducting a market study into the new car retailing industry, and we went out and surveyed thousands of workshops to find out exactly where they were struggling and what the impact was. And the main areas, it can be as simple as the oil blend. Service and repair on a vehicle is completely different to service and repair. When we were all growing up, a lot of do-it-yourself. You could go and buy a repair manual down at your hard copy repair manual down at your local auto store. But now a lot of the features on the vehicle are all computerised and so on. So I talked about oil blend. You wouldn't think that would be a state secret, but that was really, really difficult to get, and many repairers weren't able to get it. And it could be catastrophic if you put the wrong oil in a vehicle. You'll blow the engine, and the repairer will be liable for it. And what we saw from about 2016 onwards is car companies starting to put in the owner's manual in your glove box. Under oil specification, they'd put refer to dealer. Of course, when you ring up the dealer says, oh, we can't give out that information. It's intellectual property. You'll have to bring the car in. So you ask your repairer, can you get the oil for me from the dealer? The repairer rings the dealer. Dealer says, oh, we don't sell that in retail packs. You have to tell the customer to bring the car in. That's a very simple way of withholding information and manipulating the market, and certainly the car companies have used that. But it's a lot more sophisticated than that. The repair process now involves scan tools. So the first thing a repairer will do when your car comes in is not start pulling it apart. They'll hook it up to a scan tool, and the car will self-diagnose and tell the technician what they'll release. The car will put up a whole lot of fault codes if there's something wrong, and then that allows the technician to be able to diagnose, repair the fault, and then clear the codes. Problem is that the car companies are controlling that process now, so they're not providing information to be able to diagnose what the codes are. Often the codes will be greyed out and so on. So that's creating huge issues. Also, we're increasingly seeing that when technicians are replacing parts on vehicles, they're required to put in an initialisation code. Might be an 8-digit code or whatever. Again, that can only be done from the dealership or by the dealership. And the dealer has to have the car physically in their lot. So what we were seeing and what we're increasingly seeing is a repairer who's qualified, has all the tools, and has experienced staff and so on, undertaking a repair, getting right to the end, and then finding that they can't restart the vehicle because they haven't got the code. So then they're having to put a vehicle on a flatbed truck and send it to a dealership to get a code put in. And often that dealership will make them wait a week or 2 weeks. Waste of money, waste of productivity, and makes the repairer look bad in front of their customer for no reason. And the final thing we're seeing increasingly is similar to your iPhone. Car companies will do tweaks on vehicles or upgrade the systems on a vehicle through a reflash of the software. Again, though, they only send that information about the reflashing out to their dealership networks and completely avoid the independent repairers. And often they'll be sending out technical bulletins only to their dealerships. So an independent repairer might spend four hours troubleshooting a fault that's a known fault and there's a known fix from the vehicle manufacturer. Often they won't pass that on to the customer, but it's a waste of productivity and so on. Back in 2016, when we did that survey, 1 in 10 vehicles experienced issues around getting information, and on average it took 4 hours and hundreds of dollars in costs for the repairer to be able to access that information. That was back in 2016. We estimate that it would be 1 in 2, 1 in 3 vehicles now, and it was increasing exponentially as the technology on vehicles was increasing. So something had to be done. I talked earlier about the ACCC, and this is what was done. We and others lobbied for the ACCC to investigate what was going on in the industry. And one thing the ACCC do very well is they follow the money. And in this new car market study, that's exactly what they did. Now, this slide in front of you shows that whilst we've established that the car company have the technological power to be able to manipulate the market, this shows the why. Why would they do it? As I said, a $22 billion industry, and this is straight out of the ACCC market study. And what it shows is that the average gross margin on service in a dealership is 64%. 21% on parts, that's fairly reasonable, but it's a 64% that really stands out. But the other figure that really stands out here is this is a new car dealer. Look at the margins they make on a new car, 7%. It's almost, and this reminds me a lot of the inkjet printer industry, that the printer's almost the lost leader, and they make all their money selling you the cartridges or the coffee machines, similar. So this is what alerted the ACCC to the fact that there was a problem in our industry, and they looked at this. They looked at the margins, and you extrapolate that out on the overall turnover of the industry. You look at the technological advantage they have and the commercial imperative they have, and the ACCC quite rightly found that there was a market failure here and that it wasn't going to resolve itself, and because it was causing a loss of competition and consumer detriment, that there was a role for government to play in regulating the industry. So we got our legislation as a direct result of that ACCC recommendation. And essentially the legislation is an amendment to the Competition and Consumer Act. It's the first one that's ever been done for a specific industry. So there's a set of specific competition rules governing our industry now. So the legislation itself, even though it has gone through Parliament and it is law, it will be fully operational from the 1st of July 2022. So there's essentially a 12-month phase in. I won't go into a lot of detail on the legislation, but essentially it's principles based and we support that. So it talks a lot about what you're not allowed to do. And most importantly, car companies are not allowed to withhold information that they would normally share with their authorised dealer networks. They're not allowed to withhold that to independent repairers. They must provide it in the same form, same function, the same timelines that they do with their independent repairers. And importantly, the scheme design includes an industry body, and that industry body will play a key role in operationalising the scheme. So they will provide the function of educating the industry on what information is available and where to get it. They'll do manage a dispute resolution and monitoring service. They'll report back to the government on the operation of the scheme and make recommendations on how the scheme may be tweaked to make it more effective. And they'll also run a secure data release model to make sure that any security related information is protected and traceable. And that's really important because we know that one of the things that the car industry were trying to push is that you can't. They need to hold on to anything that's security or safety related. And if they had have got basically agreement from the government to do that, they would have tied everything to security and safety. And it's logical, anything on a vehicle could be tied to safety. So they have to share security related information. Now this information is not free. Repairers have to pay for it but it's on fair and reasonable commercial terms. And there is a very comprehensive definition in the legislation of what that means. And it includes benchmarks to similar information in other markets. And I think one of the most important things is that it gives a flexibility for the Minister of the day to make changes to the legislation or the scheme rules if they identify that there are activities underway that are designed to frustrate the scheme. And they're the exact words. So if car companies start finding loopholes in the scheme, then the Minister of the day has the ability to close those loopholes. That's really important. That feature and that reporting loop back from that industry association on the operation of the scheme and recommendations mean that the government has the flexibility to change things as they go, because we are in a technology-driven environment, and the technology's changing, so the scheme will need to be able to change. So it's essentially future-proofed. And the final thing I think is welcome news for many of you, because I know a lot of you aren't from the automotive industry. The government has designed this legislation as basically the forerunner for right to repair legislation in other or schemes in other sectors. It's essentially designed so that they can piggyback straight onto this legislation. And I'm being followed by someone from the ACCC. There's been a lot of activity around agricultural equipment, and I think the ACCC have flagged that that might be another sector that could be added onto this down the track. But essentially, it could the scheme could be adapted and for many other sectors. So that's certainly welcome news for everyone. This is a slide that we like to use. This is the kind of David and Goliath battle that we've been taking on, and I wanted to talk now a little bit more about our journey and share with you some of the insights and some of the learnings that we've had over that long 10 years. And make no mistake, the car industry are one of the most powerful and influential lobby groups going around. They've got lawyers at 1,000 paces. They're very well financed, and and they're very good at getting their own way. So we've come up against them, and we've won out in this case. But there's been a lot of steps to it, and I wanted to give you really just narrow it down to what I think were the key reasons why we got the outcome we did. First of all, we were very, very clear on that this was a consumer issue. This was about the consumer's right to choose who repairs their vehicle and what parts are fitted on it. In fact, our tagline for the campaign was "Your car, your choice." So we believe you buy the car, you should be able to have it repaired anywhere you like, and that repairer should have all the information they need to be able to conduct that repair effectively. We could have run a whole lot of lines. Our industry consists of 25,000 predominantly small family-owned businesses, so we could have run the small business angle, going up against the multinational car companies. We could have run on the economic input that our industry make. We could have very legitimately run on the environment. If you create a situation where cars can be conveniently and economically serviced regularly, that's great for the environment from an emissions point of view, from a fuel economy point of view. Well-maintained cars last longer, so you don't need as many new cars on the road. So there's a whole lot of environmental angles and so on, and they're all legitimate, but we kept it to the consumer angle. We did use some of those other arguments at the appropriate time, but we kept it to the one portfolio for two reasons. One is that once we got the ACCC recommendation that this situation was creating consumer detriment and that it was only going to get worse, that was very, very powerful, and the government really had no option but to act on that. So we were able to get a lever, a mechanism to essentially force the government's hand to act. The other thing we found with government relations, if you try and spread the message too wide, what you do is you end up going across different portfolios. So in the example that I used, we mainly were dealing with the Treasurer and the Assistant Treasurer in the competition portfolios. But if you start going into environment and into small business and so on, what happens is that it becomes no one's problem then. If multiple ministers have responsibility, then they can leave it to the other one. So you find that things stall. So having that very tight message and very clear, and we think if there are competition issues, that's the optimum thing to run on. The second piece of advice that we would give is anticipate the pushback. Now, we were really fortunate that, and I think the characteristics that I'll be talking about now are shared across most of your industry sectors. Most of the companies that are engaging in anti-competitive behaviour, it's fair to say, are large multinational companies. And they're hard to take on because they've got deep pockets and they're very powerful, as I said. But their Achilles heel is that they operate in the same way in different markets. And the right to repair in the automotive has been going on all around the world and continues to go on to this day. So we had the benefit, I guess, of hindsight of being able to hook up with all of our sister associations around the world and share market intel on what the car industry were going to say and what arguments they were going to run even before they ran them. And that put us in such an advantageous position. To give you an example, as we launched the campaign to parliamentarians, we actually had a brochure. I don't know whether you can see that. It's got excuses and answers. So car servicing and consumer choice, the top car industry excuses. So we're already telling them that they'll say that this is about stealing the IP on vehicles. It's about security and safety. It's about technician safety. If they're not trained properly, then they're going to kill themselves if you give them the information. The last one's a doozy, that independent repairers will steal their customers' cars if you give them information. That just doesn't make any sense at all. It's a pretty short-term business model, I would have thought. We have heard all the excuses, but we were ready for the car industry, and we had responses to those excuses before they'd even made them. This, I believe, was the game changer. Finding a way or a better way to explain your issue. One of the really difficult car industry excuses that we really had trouble countering was they were saying there is no problem. All the information's out there. How can there be a problem when you've got 25,000 independent repairers out there? They service 60% of the market. So what's the problem? They must be getting the information. So where's the issue? Now the issue obviously was in the detail, and it was getting worse, as I said. But how do you articulate that to members of Parliament to engender them to act on it? It's very difficult to do it when you're sitting in their offices in Parliament House, when there's lobbyist after lobbyist sort of going through like a revolving door, all with their legitimate issues and trying to push their positions and whatever. So we made the decision, and I think this was a groundbreaking decision. We flipped that on its head. Instead of us going to Canberra and doing the rounds, and we did all of that, but what we did was actually engage our members that were small businesses out there in every electorate in Australia, and we encouraged them to write to their local members of Parliament and invite them into their workshop, and that was absolutely incredible. The response we got from our members was absolutely amazing. We had hundreds and hundreds of them write to their local members of Parliament. We actually hosted 75 federal MP visits to workshops all around the country. And I tell you, those members of Parliament, they loved it. They loved coming into a workshop in their local constituency and meeting with real people. And our members were amazing. The way they articulated what the issue was, how it impacted on their business and the future of their business, but most importantly, how it impacted on their customers, which were all constituents of these electorates. And I'll tell you, not one of them came out of those workshops in any doubt about the issue and about the need for action. And that is why our legislation sailed through the Parliament. In fact, there were 2 hours of debates from all sides of Parliament supporting the legislation. So we had unanimous support, and it was because of this grassroots campaign. So what did we learn along the way? Well, from our industry perspective, banding together makes us very, very strong, and we can take on the most powerful, one of the most powerful lobby groups in any industry sector and win, because we're stronger together and we're stronger when we think. And I believe we're stronger as a right to repair community, and we're very, very keen now that we've got this legislation through to assist other sectors in our learning so that we can all be stronger together. That engagement model, that grassroots engagement by our independent repair workshops was just incredible. The impact that it had on members of Parliament, but also the loyalty, like we essentially brought them into our campaign and made them part of it. And the loyalty that we're enjoying now is incredible. So, if you are a membership association or whatever, or you're part of an industry that has one, bring the industry together through your industry association, and have faith in each other and back each other, and you'll be amazed at the results you can get. One of the things that I've always said is that I've always been glad that I've been on this side of the fence, because we're actually telling the truth. I'd hate to be the car industry lobby, being told what arguments you've got to run, and having to basically make it up as you go. So it's easy to be on point. It's easy to be consistent when you're actually telling the truth. And the final thing to say is that you have to have evidence and data. And they're different. So we had to have, in our case, we had to have make, model, time of day, workshop, what the issue was, and so on, down to that level. But we also had to have that high level data to show that there was a systemic issue. And we had to have persistence. Wow, Leslie Yates, our government relations manager, and I, we 10 years of our lives, and that wasn't the only thing we were working on, but 10 years of our lives, so many trips to Canberra, so many workshop visits, so many letters, and we just kept going. And we knew how important this was, and we knew that failure wasn't an option, because it would have basically spelt death by 1,000 cuts for our great industry. So we just kept doggedly going on and so on. And in the end, we got the result. And probably one of the proudest moments I've had is as the legislation went through the House of Representatives, Andrew Lee, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, had just got off his feet, and after I think 5 of his Labor colleagues had all supported the legislation, and I sent him a text message to thank him for everything that he did. The opposition and the government both were tremendously supportive of this, but I sent this text to Andrew Lee, and he responded and said, your association set the benchmark for advocacy. You're polite, you're doggedly determined, and you're fact-based. And I think that's the best compliment we can get. I'll end with a quote from David and Goliath, and we very much believe this was a David and Goliath battle. The car companies could outspend us, but we had grit, and we just kept going and going and going, and in the end, we got over the line. Now, the funny thing is that this is a pretty historic moment, but this is not the end of the war. We might have won that battle, but it's not the end of the war. And a lot of people say to me, now you've got this, what are you going to do now? I can tell you that technology is moving on. The car industry aren't going to sit on their hands. They'll have to cop this, but they're already working on telematics, which is wirelessly connected vehicles, and a whole lot of other things to try and lock us out into the future. So, and we'll keep going. We're now emboldened by this, but we will keep going, and ultimately, truth and consistency and effort will overcome even the most powerful lobby groups. So can I just finish today by expressing our gratitude to the entire Right to Repair community, and specifically to Professor Leanne Wiseman, who has been absolutely tremendous success to us, support to us. She's written numerous submissions in support of our campaign, and has been a great advocate for change in our sector. And we do feel part of this community. We're facing many of the same issues, and we're fighting against the same vested commercial interests that will try and prevent our ability to repair, reuse and repurpose. And we're proud to belong to this community, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share our journey. Thank you very much, and I look forward to taking some questions during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. It's fantastic to hear the journey that the AAA, and I would just like to apologise and make a correction. It is the Australian Automotive Aftermarket Association, which is the AAA, and they in fact have 2,600 member companies. So I'd like to just correct that. Next, I would like to invite Mark Labert from the ACCC to come along. Mark is the Director of the Agricultural Unit, and the reason we have Mark speaking to us today is that the Agricultural Unit has just released this year their final report into the agricultural machinery after-sales market inquiry that they've conducted. And Mark, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Leanne, and good morning all. So it's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you today about our market study into agricultural machinery markets. So I'd really just like to thank Leanne and her team as well for the organisation of this event, obviously persevering through great difficulty to be able to put this together in such an amazing agenda and program. So really appreciate your efforts in that as well. So I'm Mark Labert, and I'm a director in the ACCC's Agriculture Unit. So just a bit of background about me. I've been at the ACCC for approximately 11 years, working across a number of different areas, but over the last 5 to 6 years, primarily in the agriculture space. And part of our work is doing really deep dive work in agriculture markets to explore competition and fair trading issues. So that's been a key part of our work, and one of the most recent projects that we've undertaken was our study into agricultural machinery. So interestingly, our findings led to recommendations that link quite closely with the motor vehicle scheme that Stuart's just discussed, but also the broader right to repair work that's happening that Paul will discuss afterwards. So I think this presentation is neatly wedged between the two, and appropriately so. So just quickly, before I dive into the specifics of our market study, I think it's worth just broadly touching on the ACCC's role and how that interrelates with right to repair issues. So for those particularly outside the country, the ACCC is Australia's national competition, consumer protection and fair trading regulator. So we're an independent statutory authority. So in that sense, independent from government. We are not a policy body. So ultimately, it's of course for government to make policy. But through these processes, we do make recommendations, particularly in relation to market issues that from time to time, obviously, government adopts to address the issues that we identify as part of our studies. I think one of the key things in our role and one of our overall broader objectives as an organisation is promoting and maintaining competition. So one of the really emerging issues that we're seeing is, well, how do we promote and maintain competition in after-sales markets? So that's something that's been, an emerging feature in the work that we've done. So Stuart touched upon, I think, one of the initial projects in this area that we undertook, which was our 2017 car retailing market study. And I won't go through that in detail today, but it just highlights that this is an emerging issue that the ACCC is engaging with. Obviously, our recommendation in this space was taken forward by government, and the ACCC has been very pleased to see that occur. And that's something where, in these market studies, we're really diving down into the issues and looking at the really competition and fair trading issues that are impacting the markets overall. I think critical to recognise that that's our objective. We're here to look at the efficiency of markets. So the ACCC, I guess, doesn't have a horse in the race, if I can put it in those terms. We're really looking at the markets overall. So Stuart also touched upon the fact that the ACCC has an ongoing role in relation to the motor vehicle scheme, and I won't recover the ground that Stuart comprehensively addressed today in his presentation, but I think I just wanted to quickly highlight that we do have a team focused on this work going forward. Obviously, very early days with the scheme just coming into force, but something where our team in that area will be engaging and consulting closely with people going forward on those particular issues. So it's an important and exciting new piece of work for the ACCC. So just jumping into the market study. So I think we really commenced this market study as actually an offline, really small research project. So it was something where, in undertaking that initial research, we realised, actually there's some really significant issues here at play, some issues that needed to be explored further. And what we also realised is that there is substantial stakeholder interest in this particular market, and the issues emerging from issues, particularly in agricultural machinery after-sales markets. So in February 2020, we released a discussion paper, which basically set out some initial views on these particular issues, and went out to industry to seek perspectives. And obviously, as we always do with these issues, we received a wide range of different perspectives from industry stakeholders. So we received 44 submissions, and they covered a really good spectrum of the different components of the supply chain, and also people, academics and people outside the supply chain who were able to offer some really valuable insights. So I think another really important component of what we did here as well was we actually went to the purchasers themselves. So with the support of a number of agriculture industry associations, we were able to quite heavily promote a purchaser survey. It was quite a detailed survey because it really wanted us to get down to a granular level of detail that we could explore these particular issues. So we had 335 responses to that particular survey, which we found to be a good result given the challenges facing time-poor farm businesses. So our final report was released on the 4th of May in 2021. And obviously I'll speak to the findings and recommendations of that report today. So I think one thing that is worth highlighting just as you consider these points is that in this particular market study, I think the issues around right to repair and the motor vehicle scheme were really, I guess, where we landed on, not where we started. So we were looking at these issues broadly. We were looking at primary market issues as well. So not all of the focus on our work was in relation to right to repair issues from the start, but obviously as our analysis progressed, we realised that the key concerns from market participants were around those after-sales markets issues. So that's ultimately where a lot of our more major recommendations were directed. So it's been great that there's already been a bit of discussion about agricultural machinery today. So I think in some respects, this kind of question has already been answered. But just to flesh it out a little bit, I mean, why did we focus on agricultural machinery? Well, for starters, they are really substantial markets. So in terms of, these are billion dollar primary markets. And then obviously you've got your aftermarkets as well, which are very significant. I think another really important point here too is these are extremely expensive products for the whole. So we've got some data in our report, but I mean, many of these products are selling for over $300,000. They're extremely complex, amazing pieces of machinery that can do many different things and provide a range of different options for farm businesses. So it is a very substantial purchase for any business. And I think that's a critical point as well, because obviously it increases the importance of being able to have those pieces of machinery active and operational at all times. So secondly, I think the ACCC has been attuned more and more to the overseas developments in this space. So, obviously we've been seeing these developments in broader right to repair issues, but also particularly in the agriculture space. So just to give a bit of an example, a number of Canadian provinces have passed pieces of legislation that require manufacturers to supply repair parts for up to 10 years in relation to particular products. So these kind of developments are on our radar and something that encourages us to look at these issues a little bit further. Thirdly, it is an issue where the ACCC has been getting concerns for some time, and really in different spaces. So sometimes it's around specific warranty issues, other times it's more around this kind of traditional access to parts or access to repair issues as well. So based on these concerns and these coming in over a period of time, we did want to just give this a bit more of a detailed and thorough examination. So just to highlight a particular issue coming out of our purchaser survey, and this was something that was useful just in terms of really digging down into that user experience. So hopefully that slide is not too blurry, but I think this is a really interesting slide from my perspective in terms of how it illustrates the kind of preferences in terms of what is really important to purchasers of agricultural machinery. So this, the sort of purple colour identifies what's very important to the purchasers as part of the survey. And just to highlight that, I mean, looking at it, you see that customer service, ease of servicing and repair, cost of servicing and repair, and compatibility with other machinery are all ranked above the actual machinery price. So I found that to be something that's really fascinating. It just shows the level of importance that people acquiring these machineries are placing on basically post-acquisition issues, essentially. So I think that really gives you a good sense of the magnitude of these issues in the mind of the actual purchaser as well, and how critical they are to the operation of the markets. And obviously, interplaying into that is the broader competition issue around the ability for independent repairers and to be able to access those markets as well. So just to dip into the key findings now of our report. So what we identified were basically a number of different restrictions that operate that limit competition in after-sales markets for agricultural machinery and can also impact the user experience of particular products as well. So the first one I'll touch upon there is warranty restrictions. So this is obviously something that's common across a number of different markets, but certainly in some instances, there were warranty restrictions that operated that sought to restrict access to independent services or independent repairers. So that was one of the key issues and one of the key concerns, particularly from the purchaser side in this market study. So the second, look, I'll broadly describe that as technological restrictions. So technological restrictions, I think in this situation we're describing in a number of forms, but certainly things like access to software tools, technical information, and service manuals, the big ones that came across to us in terms of concerns that were raised. So they were, again, significant areas where concerns were raised about limitations of competition and difficulties experienced by particular users. So a third issue that's slightly different, but I think still highly relevant, is issues around data. So again, a number of concerns were raised about the control over and use of data, and particularly transparency in that space, and interoperability across different types of machinery. So that can be machinery across different brands, but also machinery of the same brand, but across different age profiles. One I haven't got listed there, but that was another key concern, was just the general operation of warranties, and we've heard a bit about that today as well. But there were certainly concerns about just general restrictions around time, length and scope of warranties as well. So I think an interesting component of the discussion on machinery, agricultural machinery as well, is that in a lot of instances, your consumer guarantees will run in parallel. So in Australia, consumer guarantees offer statutory protections in relation to consumer products that are purchased. But in the vast majority of instances, those protections are not going to apply to agricultural machinery, because even with the recent changes to bump that number up to $100,000 per purchase, the reality is that the vast majority of these type of products are going to be above that threshold. So just to dip a little bit more into the restrictions, and there's some interesting ones here, and actually some interesting examples have already been touched upon today, so I think that's highly useful in kind of bringing that out. So one of the big ones is around diagnostic software tools. So these kind of tools essentially are required in their repair and analysis of faults in relation to a range of different type of products. So basically that creates a lot of problems in terms of independent repairers trying to read and interpret fault codes in particular. So just to go to a bit of an anecdotal example, but certainly we've had a number of different concerns raised with us about small parts, so things like sensors or lights, and basically an inability to be able to operate the machinery based on a very small component of that particular machine not operating. So obviously that's going to be different from product to product and machinery to machinery, but certainly a number of those concerns were raised by the operators of the machinery. I think Shane in his opening address touched upon a fantastic example as well, and one of the big concerns too is that obviously it's not only the issues with the machinery itself in this space, but it's the potential knock-on effects as well. So he used the example of a farmer who's in the middle of harvest who might have a critical piece of machinery down. And the cost for a farm business who, for example, may be harvesting once a year and that's their entire income for for that particular year, it can be critically important. So we had mixed reports as part of this about time delays and things like that in relation to access to services and repairs, but certainly there is significant risk in relation to those issues. I think just another critical point as well is coming back to my point about the consumer guarantees not applying. Certainly a number of these restrictions obviously continue to apply outside a warranty period. So essentially you're outside the period in which you have any ability to seek assistance contractually in relation to the problems that you experience, but you're still subject to a number of the restrictions around technological restrictions that exist. So realistically, even though the responsibility for the machine is completely yours, you will get no assistance in terms of repairing it, those restrictions are still in place. So just to dive into some more of the survey results on the restrictions area, I think it's useful just to take a quick look at those and see some of the headline points that we've identified as part of that process. So first, I think one of the big ones that jumps out for me is that nearly half of the respondents identified situations where they'd had limited or no access to tools or manuals. So that's obviously a major issue in this particular industry, and something where significant concerns were raised with the ACCC. So adding to that, you can see that about a quarter of the survey participants had identified situations where they'd had limited or no access to spare parts. So again, a significant number. And I think third, identifying that about 17% of participants had issues with machinery only recognising specific parts, so genuine parts as they're described in the industry. So when we highlight these situations, we look at these restrictions, we consider additional restrictions in relation to warranties, and it creates an overall picture where there are a number of barriers in place to that competition in after-sales markets. So what did we recommend to deal with these issues? So we made a number of recommendations across the report, some regulatory, some non-regulatory, some dealing specifically with right to repair type issues and some not. But these are the 5 recommendations that we made that you can see before you. So first, and very much linked, and Stuart alluded to this in his presentation, we recommended that agricultural machinery be considered for inclusion in the motor vehicle scheme. So there, obviously we consider that there are, at a high level, some parallels between the work done on motor vehicles and some of the issues relating to agricultural machinery. While saying that, there are also a lot of differences as well. So there's a lot of detail there that would need to be considered in terms of how that scheme might operate. So essentially what we've recommended is that it be considered for inclusion in the scheme at their first review of that scheme, noting obviously the scheme was quite progressed when we actually released this particular report. There are obviously a lot of complicated and legitimate factors to work through here. There are obviously safety issues in relation to big and complex machinery, issues around IP, and I think there's a lot more detailed discussion that needs to happen in terms of what such a scheme might look like or how it might be incorporated into a scheme, but we really think that that's a discussion that is worth having and worth progressing. I think it's also worth noting from our perspective, we do not consider that the motor vehicle scheme would be capable of dealing with all of the issues that are currently before these particular markets, particularly in terms of issues around spare parts. So as currently drafted, the scheme wouldn't, I guess, cover those particular issues. So hence why we've also made a recommendation that agricultural machinery be included as part of any broader right to repair schemes that operate in Australia. So I think part of our thinking here is really, and it was touched upon this morning, I think where possible, it's obviously ideal if a lot of these right to repair movements can operate in parallel, so that we're seeing a consistency in the way issues are dealt with across the economy. And that obviously recognises that there's going to be specific issues in different industries that need to be acknowledged and considered. But in terms of the broad frameworks, I think from our perspective, that would obviously be ideal. So in terms of our process, I mean, it certainly wasn't a process of identifying exactly what any right to repair scheme or legislation might look like. Obviously, there's further work being done in that space. But a few of the things that we think that could probably be appropriate to consider in this area are things like granting access to diagnostic software tools and making sure that's done so on commercially reasonable terms that are, are fair to all parties. The second issue is requiring that sufficient supply of parts exists, including for a defined period of time. And thirdly, another type of issue that could be considered for such a scheme from our perspective is providing information to purchasers about how long software systems will be supported going forward. So this issue, of course, is being addressed as well in Paul and his team's work at the Productivity Commission. So obviously be very interested to continue to hear about that, and it's fantastic from our perspective that this is an ongoing discussion and these issues can be debated going forward. So I'll quickly just touch off on the final 3 recommendations. I mean, I think they are interrelated in some ways, but obviously slightly different targets. And these are basically targeted at industry in terms of best practice moving forward. I think what we'd say is that there was quite a variety in terms of approaches to things like warranties and stuff like that across different manufacturers. So obviously, in some cases, some of these things are already in practice, whereas in other cases they aren't. So our third recommendation was around providing clear and concise information about warranties at or before the point of sale. So certainly a high proportion, over half of survey respondents identified that they actually didn't have a warranty until after they'd made the product purchase. And that's obviously a fairly critical piece of transparency that you need in making that purchase. So our fourth recommendation was in relation to providing information to purchasers about data use. And again, we've highlighted that that should be done at the earliest possible opportunity in the sale process. And just our last recommendation was around compatibility and interoperability of machines. So certainly we'd heard from all sides of the discussion that there have been improvements in terms of compatibility, operating in line with ISO standards, but something where we've encouraged continued improvements in those areas to enhance that competition and ability to switch between different types of products. So just from our side, in terms of next steps, obviously we'll continue to monitor agricultural machinery markets and examine issues in those particular markets, and obviously have an interest in that moving forward. We also, at the ACCC, continue to follow up our market studies and inquiries, so we'll continue to monitor and look at the recommendations as they progress, and obviously actively participate in the policy processes that may emerge from much of the work that's happening at the moment. Finally, obviously, we have our ongoing role in relation to the motor vehicle scheme, and obviously that's an exciting and important role for the ACCC going forward. So I'll finish up there. I'd like to thank you for your time, and yeah, happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mark, and it's great to hear the work of the ACCC. Next, I would like to invite Commissioner Paul Lindwall from the Productivity Commission to come and speak about the Productivity Commission's right to repair inquiry. And I'd like to also acknowledge Commissioner Julie Abraham, who's here as well. So thank you very much for both coming. Thank you.
Thanks, Leanne. Well, it's the productivity, and hello to Julie too, and the team is here too, who can speak to anyone during a break, of course, at lunch, for example. We're a sister statutory agency, hello, yeah, Mark, and to the ACCC. We are an advisory organisation of the federal government, and this was our draft report which we put out recently. Thank you very much, Leanne, for inviting us here, and it's great to have the Repair Summit, and I'm glad we'll mostly be able to be part in person too. I'd also like to acknowledge the tremendous work of the team, and in particular the number of them here today. They've worked conscientiously for the report and to the final report, which I'll touch on as we're going forward. I'd also like to mention that our former team leader, Anna Markalev, who had two deliveries. Firstly, she delivered the draft report and recently a baby. And so that's a very welcome development for the Productivity Commission, a future PC employee perhaps. The right to repair inquiry has been fascinating with many dimensions to the topic. We released our draft report on 11 June and are inviting submissions with a response to the draft by the 23rd of July. Now, we're fairly flexible about that, so if it's a bit later, it doesn't matter too much, but that's the date anyway. We're holding public hearings later in July. We had planned to hold one in person in Sydney, but we can't do that now, so we'll hold in Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney virtually, and we welcome any people to participate as they wish. We then send our final report to the government by the 29th of October, and it has up to 25 parliamentary sitting days to table the report. And the government then, of course, decides whether to adopt our recommendations or not. In the draft report, we pose some initial views and outline where we do not yet have sufficient evidence to make a call on a recommendation. The latter form information requests, and we also expect to hold some roundtables to discuss specific areas of the report. Most of the draft recommendations, I think, can be characterised as no regrets policies, those which should be done anyway. They're worth pursuing. If I could summarise the concerns that led to our inquiry, they'd be this. 1, it's become increasingly difficult and expensive to effect a repair on a broken product, and there is a lock-in to authorised repairers. 2, spare parts are not available. 3, products are not designed to last and fail early, and consumers tend to buy new products rather than have their old products repaired, and there's been a proliferation of e-waste. But these are broad generalisations and don't always apply. In this inquiry, we've examined the evidence from submissions and our own research, and also had looked at the experience and policies of those countries overseas that have implemented a right to repair in one form or another. But what is a right to repair? There are a lot of definitions, we've heard a few today, floating around, but for the purposes of our inquiry, we've settled on this, and it may change for the final. A right to repair is the ability of consumers to have their products repaired at a competitive price by the repairer of their choice. Note that this does not mean that a consumer has the right to have a product repaired at any cost. We need to balance competing interests, those of consumers, manufacturers, retailers and governments. For example, if my halogen light, if I had one, failed, it would be prohibitively expensive to have it repaired rather than to buy a replacement LED light. So in this report, we've examined policies across a range of areas: product obsolescence and design standards, consumer law, competition in retail repair markets, intellectual property and e-waste. And I'll touch on these as we go. So the broken phone there is of the PC chair, Michael Brennan's phone, and it's a common occurrence to many of us, I'm sure. Why do some products last many years while others break quickly? Some are easy to repair, others virtually impossible. The cars in Cuba, many dating to the 1940s, are lovingly maintained by their owners, often family heirlooms. I visited there a few years ago. As you travel around Cuba, you'll see men hunched over cars, repairing engines and fixing exhaust systems. Since the country lacks replacement parts, the locals are extremely crafty and adept in their repairs. Cuban ingenuity has kept these old cars on the road. Mechanics find ways to use imperfect parts and keep things running. In Australia, the CEO of the NRMA, Rowan Lund, recently wrote, "Australians are notoriously slow at upgrading the family car. At 10 years, the average age of our cars is second oldest in the developed world." But shouldn't we be proud of this? Is it better that consumers switch over their cars in less than 10 years? We expect a washing machine to give more than 10 years service, and yet a car should be less than 10 years? Not so sure about that. We replace products for a whole range of reasons. It could be the product is broken and it's more expensive to repair than to replace. It could be that the new product offers features that we desire, or the new product is more efficient and less environmentally harmful. It could be that we like a change for the sake of fashion. The design of many products today has incorporated solid-state technology, including the Internet of Things, allowing our products to be connected and controlled remotely. This has been an important factor leading to the rapid changeover of certain products. But why do Pont du Gard, the bridge there in south of France, and the pyramids of Giza stand after so many thousands of years? It's because they were built by trial and error, over-engineered, if you will. The Roman bridges and Egyptian pyramids that were not so well constructed have collapsed long ago. Today, we can design products very precisely using the minimum materials needed for a particular product. The products are then made in a factory in a very consistent and predictable way. This has led to an increase in the mean time between failures of well-designed and well-built products, and also a narrowing in the variation of that mean time between failure. Yet products fail and break. But frequently they are being replaced because of continuing rapid technological innovation. We, the consumer, are replacing our products before they fail. Do we replace products needlessly? Yes, and I'm as guilty of that as many of us. Am I brainwashed into buying the new phone? I don't think so. Overall, we didn't find clear evidence that manufacturers deliberately design products to fail earlier. That doesn't mean that that doesn't happen, and that some manufacturers may do that, but systematically we didn't find evidence for that. Perhaps there might be merit, however, in some labelling scheme to help consumers understand how easy it is for their product to be repaired and its durability. France has such a labelling scheme, and we are investigating this further for the final report. Move on to consumer law now. Australian consumer law provides extensive and comprehensive guarantees, but the guarantees are not well understood and they can be difficult and costly to enforce. It's important to separate the manufacturer's warranty from the consumer guarantee under Australian consumer law. Warranties cannot supplant consumer guarantees, despite some misunderstanding to that effect. The rights a consumer has under the guarantees are for a repair, replacement or refund depending on the nature of the failure. The ACL, the Australian Consumer Law, provides that a product will have reasonable durability, but it doesn't define what that means. This leaves consumers, manufacturers and retailers being unsure and can cause confusion. In 2019-20, the ACCC reported over 37,600 complaints about consumer guarantees and warranties. So we think there is scope to improve the understanding of consumer guarantees and make it easier for consumers to enforce their rights. So with 3 draft recommendations in this space that we think will help, or expect will help. First, we think the ACCC should develop and publish estimates of minimum expected durability of products within major categories of common household products. We expect that this would help consumers, retailers and manufacturers better understand what a reasonable durability for such products might be. We also think that the ACCC should develop this guidance in consultation with relevant state and territory consumer regulators, consumer groups and business groups. Second, we think that there is scope for an extension of alternative dispute resolution schemes to better resolve complaints, and we cite 2 examples, one in South Australia and one from the New South Wales. And I noticed Shane Rattenbury this morning mentioned that there'll be enforceable conciliation introduced in the ACT within the next 6 weeks. ADRs, alternative dispute resolutions, can help consumers enforce their rights without the expense of going to court. Third, for systemic issues, we think that a super complaint system, which allows complaints from recognised consumer groups, could be made to the ACCC, and for these to be fast-tracked and responded to by the ACCC will help where there's an issue of widespread concern. Additionally, we've received many submissions that express concern about the availability of spare parts, you've heard that already, and software firmware updates. We're inviting further evidence to inform just how far we should go and whether there would be a net benefit in mandating manufacturers to hold spare parts for minimum periods, as well as whether software updates be provided by manufacturers for a reasonable period of time after the product has been purchased. Holding spare parts is costly, so is providing software updates for products no longer manufactured. But so too is it costly when a product cannot be repaired for the sake of one spare part. It's a balance, and that's why we're asking for more evidence. As an aside, the increasing use of 3D printing may offer a less costly way of providing spare parts in the future, just as we now see an increasing use of print on demand for rarely purchased books. In 2018, there were about 57,000 repair and maintenance businesses and over 203,000 workers. The repair sector generated about $35 billion in sales revenue. It's probably not surprising, as we heard earlier, that the largest repair industry in Australia is for motor vehicles. There were 40,000 of them in 2020. They are large, expensive and complex mechanical and computerised products requiring regular maintenance. The next largest repair industry is machinery repair, including for agriculture, construction and mining machinery, of which there are around 10,000 repair businesses. Appliance repair, such as for washing machines, ovens, air conditioner units, water heaters and so on, comprises mostly of small businesses. It's experienced relatively strong growth over the last 10 years, but also some consolidation. Finally, the electronics repair industry for computers, mobile phones and so on is a small part of the sector and has been declining, probably due to the relative cost of repair to replacement. I should also note the growing preponderance of repair cafes, and I spoke to a person over here earlier today about that, one in Canberra. And a common refrain to this inquiry, so the repair sector is a mixture of independent and authorised repairers. The common refrain to this inquiry is that the efforts of manufacturers and retailers is to send customers to their authorised repairers and make it difficult for independent repairers. In this report, we discuss the interactions between competition in the primary market, the original product purchase, and in the secondary market, the repair market. A highly competitive primary market can mitigate, at least to some extent, the negative effects of an uncompetitive secondary market. That said, there are several products for which market characteristics, including high consumer lock-in and limited product competition, may mean that competition in those repair markets is limited. And for the draft report, we identified agricultural machinery and mobile phones and tablets as products which there's likely to be consumer detriment. We also looked at concerns in repair markets for motor vehicles, construction machinery, watches and medical equipment, and there's a number of examples of those in the report. The cost of repair is driven mainly by labour costs, and this is one reason why many products are often less expensive to replace than to repair, although examples of the difficulty in replacing the screens and batteries of smartphones are manifold. These design features, making repair difficult, are not unique to Australia, and we are a net importer of most of the technology. That said, we're looking at the potential for labelling schemes, as I mentioned before, that exist in France. The labour-intensive nature of repair is such that the relative price of new electronics, and you can see that in the left here, over a 20-year period has declined rapidly in real terms compared to the repair. And that's understandable because it's produced in mass in a capital-intensive form and has fallen rapidly. Aside from potential labelling schemes, there are a number of measures which we propose and wish to examine further to promote competition in the repair sector. And this is about IP. First, should we amend copyright law to provide better access to repair information, manuals, schematics and diagnostic information, which can often be hidden behind technological protection measures, such as digital locks? This could be achieved via a specific fair dealing exception in the Copyright Act for the reproduction of sharing of repair information. Or it could be through a general, broader fair use exception in the Copyright Act, something we recommended in the 2016 Intellectual Property Arrangements Inquiry Report. It's notable that the United States has a fair use exception to its copyright laws. And where repair information is hidden behind a technological protection measure, would allowing repairers to distribute and share tools to circumvent such measures to access repair information be beneficial? That's a question. A step beyond such intellectual property options would be a positive obligation on a manufacturer to supply spare parts, diagnostic equipment and repair manuals to independent repairers. And if we went that far, to which types of products should that apply? What that obligation? We don't make a recommendation on such a copyright and positive obligation options in the draft report because we need to ascertain that there will be a net benefit from doing so. We need to examine potential unintended consequences and the effects of such proposals on the primary and secondary markets. Warranty terms. Under Australian consumer law, the consumer guarantees are not voided if a consumer has their product repaired by an independent repairer. However, manufacturer warranties can include terms that void the warranty after any independent repairs or if aftermarket parts are used. We examined a number of warranties and found several examples of these voiding clauses. But warranty terms cannot displace the consumer guarantees. To make this clearer for consumers, we've recommended that there be additional mandatory warranty text which would clearly state that the entitlements to consumer guarantees under consumer law do not require consumers to use authorised repair services or parts. A step beyond this, which we canvass but do not yet recommend, is whether a provision such as the US Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act should apply in Australia. That is, manufacturers would not be able to void warranties if a consumer used an independent repairer. I'll now move on to the final part about e-waste. As Shane Rattenbury mentioned earlier, e-waste is a growing problem in Australia as elsewhere as more and more products use electronic components. Its share of total waste is currently less than 1%, but over the past 10 years, the weight of e-waste has grown 131% compared to 41% for general waste. E-waste consists of many materials, some of which is valuable and some hazardous. The range of materials changes over time. However, as product design and regulations change. Fluorocarbons found in fridges and air conditioners, for example, have been phased out. And the products which presently make up most e-waste include such things as cathode ray tubes televisions, CRT televisions, which are no longer manufactured. Sustainability Victoria forecasts that solar panels will comprise around 10% of e-waste in 2035, up from less than 1% in 2015. So it's to point out that what the materials will change over time, and we have to be aware of that. While Australia's landfill management practices are generally effective, clearly if materials which would otherwise end up in landfill are able to be efficiently reused or recycled, they should be. A product stewardship scheme, where a manufacturer or importer takes responsibility for the waste of its products, is one way to reduce e-waste. But a feature of such schemes, such as the National Television and Computer Recycling Scheme, is that they tend to incentivise recycling over repair or reuse. We think that there should be a change to that scheme so that e-waste products that have been repaired or reused count towards the scheme targets. There will need to be design changes, of course, and perhaps even a name change. It can't be a recycling scheme after all then. And it would be important to have a good scheme designed to prevent rotting of it. Australia has a relatively small population with limited e-waste recycling capacity because of its dispersed population and high labour costs. So the scope for large-scale, efficient recycling in Australia is limited. The lack of cost-effective domestic recycling can increase the incentives to stockpile, dump or unlawfully export e-waste. Exporting of e-waste itself is not problematic, provided it is to destinations that efficiently and safely recycle the waste. Australia is a signatory to the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and their Disposal, but not yet the Basel-bound Amendment of 1995, which prohibits signatory states from exporting hazardous wastes to countries other than the OECD or EU countries. We're recommending the use of GPS trackers, which are relatively low cost and can be used to see where e-waste is ending up. A risk-based sampling approach would be a useful method of focusing on the types of products and supply chains that have the highest risk to unlawful exports. And in conclusion, this draft report, the Commission has sought to address concerns around a right to repair from a number of angles. There's no silver bullet, however, nor will a right to repair solve by itself e-waste concerns. But there are measures which we are proposing and which we are examining further for the final report that would make a measurable improvement to concerns around sustainability. But it also behoves all of us as consumers to be aware of our patterns of consumption. I'm not a fan of buy now, pay later schemes, which is a form of instant gratification. Perhaps further consumer education campaigns might help, but our own behaviour as consumers should be the one that sets a good example. As for the ubiquitous smartphone, did you know that according to a US survey, 46% of those surveyed over the age of 18 use their phone 5 to 6 hours a day? Taking the median, that's over 2,000 hours in a year. That's a lot more usage than pretty much every other product you have. Your washing machine, maybe you use it 150 hours in a year. Your car, maybe 100 hours. If your smartphone lasts 4 years, that's 8,000 hours, and there's only 8,760 hours in a year. So thank you for listening and contributing to the PC report, and I hope to see submissions and also appearing at our hearing. Thanks, Leanne.
Thank you, Paul. That was an excellent overview of the draft report. We would like to invite Stuart back to join us for the Q&A session. We're conscious of the time. We may eat into a little bit of our lunch break because I think this is the most valuable time when people are able to ask questions. We have a number of questions that have come through, and Anna is going to read them out for the panellists. Thank you. Thank you, Stuart. Paul.
Okay, so the first question is from Ken, Is this legislation purely for repair? So I assume this is addressed to Stuart. Is this legislation purely for repair and maintenance, or is access for other third-party aftermarket product service providers enabled, for example, modifications?
Look, thanks for the question. Yes, the answer is it is going to include other providers. So the legislation actually defines a repairer as someone that engages in modification as well. So it includes vehicle modifiers. And there are specific arrangements around supply chain, so parts suppliers and scan tool companies and independent third-party providers. So it is a comprehensive scheme that covers all the market participants.
Thank you. Another one for Stuart here. Electronic vehicles need much less servicing. As profit on car sales is so low, how will manufacturers game the system to offset the loss of servicing profit?
Well, as I said at the end of my presentation, we believe we've won a battle, but we certainly haven't won the war. And our biggest barrier going forward is technology. So Kyle talked about in his presentation earlier about there was a Massachusetts ballot around connected cars and sharing of car data, and we believe that's where the battle is going to go. Cars are able now to collect and transmit information around where they are, the operation of the vehicle and so on, but that information is very valuable, and the car industry want control over that information so that they can use it for their own purposes, but also on-sell it to other third-party service providers, which will give them a very, very powerful revenue stream. Our view is that, again, like your car, your choice in terms of repair, data should be around your car, your data. So you should have, as a car owner, full transparency over what data your vehicle is collecting, who it's being transmitted to, and for what purpose it's used for, and you should have choice over who receives it and for what purpose. So that's kind of the next iteration in right to repair for motor vehicles.
Thank you. For the ACCC, many consumers are receiving verbal advice that they will void their warranty if they use an independent repairer. What can be done to address this?
Well, I think there's two issues here. So I'll deal with the warranty issue first. I mean, so warranties are obviously a voluntary contractual agreement entered into between two parties. So ultimately, under Australian law as it currently stands, basically the setter of the warranty can identify what those terms and conditions are. So you'll be subject to those terms and conditions in a particular warranty that you enter into. The point I would probably highlight here, and Paul did make this point, is that the consumer guarantees will also apply. So these are statutory protections. You cannot contract out of those protections. It's actually a breach of the Australian consumer law to indicate that those particular protections don't apply. So I think that that's really critical in terms of the education piece, but also just in terms of getting that message out more broadly that those protections are going to apply where the consumer guarantees operate. So I think two distinct issues, but important to kind of be aware of the way that they both operate.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Is insurance going to be mandatory for independent repairers? Where do I stand if a repairer does something that impacts warranty? So just leave that open.
I'm happy to have a first go at it, and Mark can probably add to this, but as we've been talking about, there's obviously the manufacturer's warranty and your consumer guarantee statutory rights that operate in parallel, and there's a lot of focus, too much focus, we believe, on manufacturer's warranties, and particularly where they're conditional. The simple fact is that an independent repairer from a mechanical workshop point of view is required to provide goods and services and essentially warrant those. So if you take your car to an independent repairer and they don't repair it correctly, or the part fails or so on, then it's under their obligations to rectify that issue and any consequential loss or damage that results of that as a result of that. Where there's some complications is, or some confusion is that manufacturers aren't able to condition their manufacturer's warranties, but often they will tell car owners that if you take your car to an independent repairer or use so-called non-genuine parts, then you void your warranty. That's actually illegal to say that. They cannot do that, and they can't enforce it. I think there is an education piece there for consumers that they do have statutory rights, whether they go to a dealer or an independent repairer.
Yeah, I'd support that, Stuart. I think just to add to that, there is a obligation under the Australian Consumer Law that all services are carried out with due care and skill. So that's going to apply in all circumstances in relation to the quality of the work provided by whoever undertakes those services.
Next question, another open one. Where will the liability lay for accidents that have been created by third-party modifications on agricultural equipment?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because it obviously depends on what's happened in the particular circumstances. Obviously, liabilities are a much broader issue in that particular space. So I think we've already highlighted there that there are obligations that are imposed on particular service providers, and there may be intervening acts in the sale of a product that may lead to liability elsewhere. This is obviously an important issue, but I think it's a difficult question because it would obviously depend on what happens in the circumstances, what caused the particular incident, whether that was driven by the particular user of the product, driven by the product in its original form, or driven by any intervening acts. So slightly circumstantial, I think, that one.
Yes. Keep going. Cool. Okay, so next open question again. This is from Kate and it's for Mark. Can the example of Caterpillar, who have a product as a service business model, give us anything that we can implement here in Australia?
I'm not familiar with the particular model that's describing. So without speaking about individual companies, I think it certainly is an option. I think in terms of farm businesses in Australia, there's certainly still, I think, a desire to own and operate their own products based on our understanding of how they operate. And certainly some of the concerns raised with us were actually probably the opposite, restrictions around their ability to maintain control over their own data, and essentially products operating like a bit of a license. So I think it's something that certainly be explored, and I think it was discussed earlier. We'll probably see a bit more of a hybrid model going forward. So I suspect that's probably somewhere we might see going forward in this space.
Okay, next question. For manufacturers, particularly small businesses which make efforts towards making available information or parts, what has been done to assist or encourage or protect this? Would you like me to repeat the question? Sure. Sure. So for manufacturers, in particular small businesses, who make efforts towards making available information and parts, what has been done to assist or encourage? And that's what it says there, so yeah.
Well, I think in all of these issues, we'd obviously be encouraging anything that seeks to promote competition and promote the user experience. So from an ACCC side, we, I guess, probably haven't had a historical role in terms of education activities, but certainly I know there are a number of, bodies present at this particular forum and other industry associations who are seeking to promote parties that are exhibiting, I guess, pro-competitive and best practice behaviours. So I think that's something where that should be encouraged. Obviously, there is a risk of, I think, drawing really broad conclusions on some of these issues. Obviously, manufacturers operate in different ways and some are aligning with best practice and maybe some aren't. So I think anything that can be done across the advocacy space to I guess, promote positively behaviours that really exhibit that best practice space, I think is something that can only be useful.
And calling out bad behaviour really is always important too.
We do have a few more questions here, but perhaps we might open it up if anyone in the audience has questions. Or...
Sure. Are there any questions? We have a microphone just because of the online audience if any questions are asked here. we'd like you to use a microphone. Do we have any questions in the audience specifically? We can thank you.
Yeah, hi, my name is Lauren George and I work at the Commonwealth Treasury. I work in the area of government responsible for the Australian consumer law and was actually responsible for developing and drafting the motor vehicle scheme. So I just want to thank Stuart for the presentation today. I just perhaps wanted to make a comment. We'll of course be very interested in the Productivity Commission's inquiry when it is handed down later on in the year. I just wanted to perhaps say to participants that Australia does face a unique set of challenges in our legal system, particularly with our constitution. And I just perhaps wanted to draw out that Stuart definitely made the comment that our legislation did sail through the Parliament. That is correct. But it took a long time to get to introduction, and there were a number of issues that we did need to work through. We also have an Australian consumer law that mirrors state and territory law, so we do need to work closely with our state and territory counterparts. So I just wanted to flag for anybody thinking about the right to repair space. We're very interested in it from a sustainability perspective. We obviously think that this legislation is pretty good. You know, I'm a bit biased. It's first of its kind in Australia, but also in the broader Asia-Pacific region. So I suppose I just wanted to make the comment that for anyone out there who is thinking about this space, we do need to think about Australia's specific circumstances. It's not as simple as it is in the US. I would note that their motor scheme is mandatory in one state and voluntary in all the others, and they have had good success with working with the manufacturers to make a scheme that is, you know, standing the test of time over the last 20 years. But we do have a very different set of laws in Australia.
I think that's a very good point that you make, and thank you very much for your efforts in drafting that legislation. But we are aware of the complexities in terms of legislating in Australia, and I think that's a very good point that you make. We do have a question here, and I would just like to raise it, Mark, with you in relation to the purchaser survey with the agricultural machinery. Can you give us a sense, and this question is asking really, you've got 335 responses, is what percentage of farmers in Australia? So I think the question is really saying how well did that survey go out, and was it uptake, and what's the data around the responses?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good question. So we considered that a significant response in terms of obviously busy farm businesses and promoting that survey. We promoted that survey quite widely through a number of industry associations and others. So in saying that, we obviously appreciate that there are many other farm businesses out there experiencing different issues, and in these type of surveys as well, you can be more likely to hear from people who have concerns. So we obviously acknowledge those issues, and it's only one of the mechanisms that we used in our report to reach our particular findings. I think what's also recognised in our report is the need for ongoing work in this space, and I think that's explicitly highlighted. So obviously Paul and his team are doing some work in that space, and any sort of regulatory response would obviously need to be informed by things like a regulatory impact statement to basically test the broader cost benefits in this space. So I think we think it's a really good representation of the information that's out there in terms of the survey, but also acknowledge that you'd need to do further work to understand more of the detail.
Thank you, Mark. I think that's a very good point, and I think, Paul, you'll agree that the Productivity Commission has picked up on this point about the need for continual monitoring and review, and one of your recommendations is that the mandatory data sharing in the motor vehicle industry should be reviewed after a 3-year period, and that will be a really interesting time, I think, to...
Yeah, well, we're always... can you hear that?
Yes.
We're always keen that any regulation be reviewed at particular periods of time or regularly, because factors change. We need to make sure that it's working properly. What was the objective of the scheme? Is it being met at the cost-effective way, for example? Should it be changed in some way? So regular review of regulation across the board is really important, actually.
I think that's a very good point. And in terms of data collection about what's working and what needs improving as well. So I think we have eaten into a little bit of our lunch break, but I think that was worthwhile. I'd like to thank you both again, and you, Stuart, as well, for your contributions and today and your story of your journey. And Paul, thank you very much. And Mark, thank you very much for your time. Thank you. And thank you all for your questions.